The search for missing individuals in Gaza amidst the ongoing conflict is a brutal and often futile exercise that exposes the deep, unrelenting grief of families who are left to sift through the wreckage for their loved ones. The destruction caused by Israel's airstrikes has left entire neighborhoods in ruins, with little left to distinguish personal belongings or remains from the shattered debris. In these chaotic conditions, survivors and emergency responders rely on items like multicolored backpacks, shoes, or shrapnel-riddled pots as potential markers to identify where the bodies of the deceased may lie. In some cases, these fragments of clothing and belongings are the only clues that remain to guide teams searching for the missing. Haytham Al-Hums, the director of emergency and ambulance services for the civil defense in Rafah, at Gaza's southern border, has reported that his team receives a daily influx of calls from civilians desperately seeking their missing relatives under collapsed buildings. These families are often left with no option but to rely on grim methods, such as the overwhelming smell of decay radiating from the rubble, to locate the bodies of their loved ones. The search is both emotionally and physically taxing, as often, what is recovered is no more than a pile of dismembered bones or fragments of human remains. Sometimes, even the identifying features are lost, and the remains are catalogued simply as unidentified, majhul in Arabic, a chilling reminder of how mass destruction has rendered human lives indistinguishable from the ruins. Despite the immense efforts of rescue teams, the ongoing violence and instability of the region severely hinder recovery operations. Osama Saleh, a resident of Rafah, recounts his return home after a ceasefire, only to discover a long-dead body in his house, a skeleton whose skull was fractured. He believes the body had been there for months, slowly decomposing in the absence of help. "We are humans with feelings? I can't convey how miserable the tragedy is," Saleh says, his voice reflecting the emotional toll of encountering such devastation. For many families, the search for their missing relatives extends beyond the rubble of homes and buildings into hospitals, where families examine collections of bones and clothing stored in body bags. Abdul Salam al-Mughayr, a young man from Rafah, went missing in the Shabura area, a place known for its extreme danger during the conflict. His uncle Zaki had avoided searching for him there, fearing the worst. When remains that seemed to match Abdul Salam's description were found, his family, with the help of hospital workers, carefully examined the bones, clothing, and shoes. Despite the grim confirmation that the remains belonged to Abdul Salam, there was little sense of closure, just the painful reality of losing someone and then identifying their shattered remains. Amidst this overwhelming tragedy, Lina Al-Dabea's story offers a particularly heartrending example of loss and despair. Lina's daughter, 13-year-old Aya, had been living in a school in Gaza City with hundreds of other refugees. Early in the conflict, Aya went to use the bathroom when she was tragically shot in the chest by an Israeli sniper. While Israel asserts that it does not target civilians, the United Nations Human Rights Office reported that during the conflict, Israeli forces engaged in intense shooting in densely populated areas, resulting in unlawful killings, including of unarmed bystanders. Aya's family buried her near the school in a makeshift grave, hoping to return once the fighting had subsided to recover her remains. However, when Lina later sought out the grave, the reality was far worse than she could have imagined. Aya's body had been desecrated, her head was found in one place, her legs in another, and her ribs scattered elsewhere. "I couldn't understand how my daughter was taken out of her grave, and how did the dogs eat her?" Lina cries, her grief palpable. She is haunted by the brutal way in which her child's remains were treated by the ravages of war, compounded by her inability to protect her daughter in those final moments. The incident exemplifies the brutal consequences of war, particularly in an area where civilians are trapped in the crossfire. The psychological and emotional toll on families left to cope with the aftermath of such violence is immeasurable. The trauma of losing a loved one in these circumstances, and the subsequent pain of having to search for and identify their remains, is compounded by the fear and uncertainty that pervades every moment of their lives. Aya's family, like many others, is left with no real answers, no comfort, and a question that continues to haunt them: what could they have done differently? In the case of Aya's mother, Lina, that question remains unanswered, as she faces the overwhelming realization that her daughter's body was lost to the violence, a victim of a war that showed no mercy. The weight of that loss lingers as Lina and her family prepare to transport Aya's remains for a proper burial, one final act of love in a situation that offers no true closure. In Gaza, the human cost of conflict is measured not just in lives lost, but in the immeasurable suffering of those left behind. Families search for the missing, recover the dead, and endure the agonizing process of identifying remains, all while grappling with the reality of a war that has left them broken and forever changed. Each story, each individual loss, is a testament to the devastating toll that violence and conflict inflict on innocent civilians caught in the middle.